that the surface temperature of Venus is 900 degrees Fahrenheit. That's hotter than a baker's oven. Lead would be molten at that temperature. And when it rains sulfuric acid. And the pressure of the air is 100 times that of the Earth. It would crush you.
They told him to take it to his grave. For decades, he did. But on his deathbed, a Soviet astronaut broke the silence. And what he revealed has left scientists completely speechless. The Soviet space program was celebrated as one of humanity's greatest achievements. But behind the victories, behind the records and the milestones, something was being hidden. Something huge.
Passing a note making global headlines at this hour, we have learned this evening that Mikhail Gorbachev has died, the last leader of the Soviet Union who helped end the Cold War and the threat of nuclear war. And we've also learned tonight of his final request.
And the moment this man decided to talk, everything changed. Venus is not a place that welcomes visitors. The surface temperature sits at around 465 degrees Celsius on average, which is hot enough to melt lead. It rains sulfuric acid. The atmospheric pressure is about 92 times greater than what we experience here on Earth, which means any unprotected object, or person, would be crushed almost instantly. It is, by almost every measure, one of the most hostile environments in our solar system. And yet, decades before anyone was seriously talking about sending humans to Mars, the Soviet Union was already trying to land spacecraft there. To understand why, you have to go back to the middle of the 20th century, when two of the world's most powerful nations were locked in a competition that went far beyond military strength or political ideology. After the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union found themselves in a standoff that would come to define an entire era. Unable to dominate one another directly, both nations looked elsewhere for ways to demonstrate their superiority. They found it in outer space. The space race, as it became known, was not simply a matter of national pride, although there was certainly a great deal of that involved. It was also a very public demonstration of scientific and technological capability. Every launch, every orbit, every milestone achieved in space sent a message to the rest of the world about which system, capitalism or communism, was producing better science, better engineers, and better results. The stakes could not have felt higher at the time. The Soviet Union moved quickly. In 1957, they launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite, catching the United States off guard and sending a wave of anxiety through the American public. Not long after, they sent the first animal into Earth's orbit. Then came the milestone that still stands today as one of the most remarkable achievements in space exploration history. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to travel to space. 2 years later, in 1963, Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman to do the same. These were not small achievements. They were signals to the world that the Soviet space program was operating at a level that nobody else had yet matched. What is less commonly discussed, however, is what the Soviets were doing beyond the headlines. While the world's attention was largely focused on the moon and on the American effort to land a human being on its surface, the Soviet Union had quietly set its sights on something else entirely. They wanted to be the first to explore another planet's atmosphere. The planet they chose was Venus. This decision was bold, to say the least. Venus had long been a source of fascination and mystery. Shrouded in thick, dense clouds that blocked any direct view of the surface, scientists at the time knew relatively little about what lay beneath. Some had speculated that Venus might be a warm, tropical world. The reality turned out to be something very different. But before any of that could be confirmed, someone had to get there first. The Venera program, which is the Russian word for Venus, was the Soviet Union's dedicated effort to explore the planet. It began in the early 1960s and would ultimately run for over 2 decades, producing some of the most significant data ever gathered about another planet. The early missions did not go smoothly. The first 2 Venera probes failed before they could reach their target. Venera 3, launched in 1965, did manage to reach Venus, but it crashed on the surface without returning any useful data. These were setbacks, but they were not enough to stop the program. By 1967, Venera 4 changed everything. It became the first spacecraft to successfully enter another planet's atmosphere and transmit data back to Earth. What it found confirmed just how extreme conditions on Venus really were. The atmosphere was found to be composed almost entirely of carbon dioxide, with no detectable oxygen or water. There was no magnetic field. The pressure was immense. Venera 4 spent around 90 minutes collecting data before the conditions overwhelmed it, and it stopped functioning. 90 minutes was enough. Scientists now had their first real look at what Venus was actually like, and the picture it painted was a far cry from the tropical paradise some had imagined. The missions that followed built on this foundation. Venera 5 and Venera 6 were launched in January 1969, just days apart. These newer models came with upgraded designs, intended to withstand greater pressure and collect more precise measurements. Each successive mission added to the growing body of knowledge about the planet. Venera 8 went a step further and was able to capture both images and recordings from the Venusian surface, even in the midst of conditions that would destroy most equipment within minutes. The most impressive missions in the program were arguably Venera 9 through 12, launched between 1975 and 1978. Each of these probes weighed up to around 5,000 kilograms, and the landers they carried were capable of taking clear, high-quality photographs of the surface. For the first time in history, human beings had actual images of another planet's surface taken from the ground level. These were not distant observations from orbit. These were photographs taken from the surface of Venus itself. And yet, for a long time, almost nobody outside the Soviet Union knew about them. The photographs were kept secret. The details of what the probes had found were not shared with the wider scientific community. The Soviet Union had achieved something extraordinary, and they had chosen to keep it to themselves. It would take years before that information made its way out to the rest of the world. This pattern of secrecy is one of the defining features of the Soviet space program. Achievements were announced selectively, failures were quietly buried. Data was classified and withheld. Some of what was hidden only came to light decades later, revealed not through official channels, but through individuals who had been part of the program and chose at some point to speak. The reasons behind this secrecy were not entirely mysterious. The space race was, at its core, an information war as much as it was a technological one. Sharing data meant sharing capabilities. Sharing capabilities meant giving a rival nation insight into what you could and could not do. In that context, keeping scientific discoveries classified was not unusual. It was standard practice. What makes it worth examining now is not simply the history itself, but what that history means in light of everything we have learned since. The questions the Venera program was trying to answer about Venus have not gone away. If anything, they have become more urgent. In recent years, Venus has re-emerged as a serious focus of scientific interest. Researchers studying the planet's atmosphere have reported findings that have generated significant debate within the scientific community. Observations presented in 2024 included what some scientists described as new and stronger evidence for the presence of phosphine in Venus's atmosphere. On Earth, phosphine is a gas that is produced either industrially or by living microorganisms. Its detection on Venus does not prove the existence of life, and many scientists remain cautious about drawing any firm conclusions. But it has raised a question that is difficult to simply dismiss. If the gas is there, where is it coming from? The debate is ongoing, and it is unlikely to be resolved quickly, but it has sparked a new wave of interest in sending missions back to Venus. One of the most notable of these is the Venus Life Finder, a privately funded mission being developed by Rocket Lab in collaboration with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The mission is currently planned for no earlier than summer 2026, and its goal is to send a small atmospheric probe directly into Venus's cloud layer to search for signs of organic chemistry. It would be the first private mission to another planet, and its target is the same world that Soviet engineers were trying to reach more than 60 years ago. What the Venera missions gathered, and what may still be waiting in archives that have never been fully opened, could turn out to matter a great deal as that search continues. The Soviet Union spent decades collecting data from one of the most difficult environments in the solar system. Not all of that data has been made public. And as scientists begin asking new questions about Venus, the answers to some of them may have already been found, written down, and locked away, waiting for someone to decide the time has finally come to share them. While the Venera program was pushing the boundaries of what was possible on Venus, the Soviet Union was simultaneously turning its attention to another world. Mars had captured the imagination of scientists and ordinary people alike for generations. It was closer to Earth than Venus in many ways that mattered. similar day length, polar ice caps, seasons, and for a long time it seemed like the most promising candidate for life beyond our own planet. For the Soviets, it was also the next logical frontier in their effort to stay ahead in the space race. The Soviet Mars program ran from 1960 through to 1973 and represented one of the most ambitious series of deep space missions ever attempted. The spacecraft involved were sophisticated for their time, carrying instruments designed to measure everything from atmospheric pressure and water vapor levels to the intensity and direction of magnetic fields. Ultraviolet spectrometers were included to analyze the atmosphere and soil. Infrared sensors and photocameras were packed alongside magnetometers. These were not simple probes being flung into the void on the off chance they might pick something up. They were carefully designed scientific platforms built to answer specific questions about a specific world. The early missions did not go well. The first launch attempt in 1969 ended in complete failure due to a combination of design faults and technical problems that never gave the spacecraft a real chance. It was a frustrating start, but the program pressed on. Engineers went back to their designs, identified what had gone wrong, and tried again. Mars 2 and Mars 3 were the missions that would define the program. Launched within days of each other in May 1971, both spacecraft weighed around 4,650 kilograms and were built around the same fundamental design. Each one consisted of two main components: an orbiter, which would circle Mars and collect data from above, and a landing module, which would attempt to descend through the Martian atmosphere and touch down on the surface. The landing system was a remarkable piece of engineering for its time. It involved the deployment of a parachute specially designed for the thinner Martian atmosphere, followed by the activation of retro rockets to slow the descent and allow for a controlled touchdown. Getting all of that to work correctly across hundreds of millions of kilometers of space, with no possibility of real-time adjustments from Earth, required a level of precision that pushed the limits of what Soviet engineers could reliably deliver. Mars 2 did not make it. When the time came for its landing sequence to engage, the rocket systems failed at the critical moment, and the spacecraft crashed onto the Martian surface. It was a significant blow, particularly given how much had been invested in the mission. But there was still Mars 3. Mars 3 landed successfully on the 2nd of December 1971, becoming the first man-made object to achieve a soft landing on the surface of Mars. It was a genuinely historic moment, and for the Soviet space program, it represented another milestone that no other nation had managed to reach first. The lander settled onto the Martian surface and began transmitting data back to Earth. Scientists at the receiving stations must have held their breath. What came through was limited, but it was real. Mars 3 transmitted the first ever live image from the surface of Mars. The image itself was not dramatic, little more than a grey, featureless background, but the fact that it existed at all was remarkable. A machine built by human hands had landed on another planet and sent back proof that it had done so. Then, after around 15 seconds of transmission, everything went silent. Mars 3 never made contact again. The cause of the sudden loss of signal has never been definitively established. One widely accepted theory is that a massive dust storm, which had been sweeping across the Martian surface at the time, overwhelmed the lander's systems and brought the mission to a premature end. Mars is known for dust storms of extraordinary scale, storms that can last for weeks and reduce visibility across the entire planet. The last thing the cameras on Mars 3 appeared to capture before going dark was a grey, undifferentiated background, which is consistent with what a dust storm of that magnitude would look like up close. Other theories have been put forward over the years, including the possibility that some kind of electrical discharge from the storm interfered with the lander's electronics. A small number of people have suggested more exotic explanations, but the dust storm hypothesis remains the most scientifically credible. One of the most fascinating, and for a long time, most secret, aspects of the Mars 3 mission was a small device that was supposed to accompany the lander on its exploration of the surface. The Prop M, as it was known, was a tiny rover weighing approximately 5 kilograms and shaped roughly like a square. It was designed to move across the Martian terrain using a set of skis that gave it a kind of hopping movement, allowing it to navigate the uneven and rocky surface more effectively than wheels might have managed. Sensors built into the device were capable of detecting obstacles ahead, boulders, ditches, sudden drops, and adjusting course to avoid them. It was programmed to stop at regular intervals and take measurements of the soil it was moving over, gathering data on density, texture, and structural strength. What makes the Prop M particularly remarkable is not just what it was designed to do, but when it was designed. This was 1971. The concept of a small, semi-autonomous robot navigating another planet's surface is something most people associate with the modern era of space exploration. And yet the Soviets were already building something that functioned on broadly similar principles more than 50 years ago. The Prop M was tethered to the Mars 3 lander by a cable of about 15 meters in length and could only operate within the field of view of the lander's cameras, which was a significant limitation. But within those constraints, it represented a genuinely forward-thinking piece of engineering. It never got the chance to do its job. Mars 3 went silent before the rover could be deployed properly, and the Prop M's brief existence on the Martian surface came to nothing. What makes this story stranger still is that the Soviets never mentioned the Prop M in their official mission reports. For over 20 years, its existence was simply not acknowledged. It was only in 1990 that details of the rover finally became public, when the information was leaked and the wider world learned that the Soviet Union had deployed robotic exploration devices on Mars years before anyone else had attempted anything similar. Reports also suggested that later missions, including Mars 6 and Mars 7, had carried their own rovers. How much of what those missions gathered was ever fully shared remains unclear. The secrecy surrounding these achievements was consistent with how the Soviet space program operated more broadly. Successes were announced when they served a political purpose. Failures were buried, and certain discoveries or capabilities were held back entirely, either because sharing them would have revealed too much about Soviet technology, or because the data itself raised questions that the authorities were not ready to address publicly. Years later, an effort was made to find out what had actually happened to Mars 3. In 2005, NASA launched the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, a sophisticated spacecraft equipped with a high-resolution camera capable of capturing detail on the Martian surface that had never been possible before. One of its objectives was to search for physical evidence of the Mars 3 landing. Using the data transmitted during those brief 15 seconds of contact, American scientists attempted to calculate where the lander had come down, and the orbiter began scanning that area of the surface. What it found was striking. Images captured by the orbiter showed what appeared to be debris consistent with a crashed spacecraft, a circular metallic object that could have been the lander, a parachute that appeared to have survived the decades of Martian weather remarkably intact, and a dark patch nearby that was suspected to be the original landing point. It was not definitive proof of exactly what had happened to Mars 3, but it was confirmation that the mission had been real and that the evidence of it was still there, preserved in the Martian dust. The fact that it was NASA, the Soviet Union's great rival, that helped confirm the authenticity of the Mars 3 landing adds a certain irony to the story. Two nations that had spent decades treating every space achievement as a matter of national competition ended up, in some ways, completing each other's work. That spirit of cooperation would eventually find more formal expression. The International Space Station, which has been continuously inhabited since the year 2000, is in many ways the most visible symbol of what became possible once the space race ended, and the two former rivals found reasons to work together rather than against each other. But the search for life that originally motivated so much of the Soviet Mars program has taken on new dimensions in recent years. In September 2025, NASA announced that its Perseverance rover had collected a rock sample from Mars's Jezero crater, taken from a formation called Bright Angel, within an ancient river valley that contains what scientists are describing as potential biosignatures. The sample, known as Sapphire Canyon, was taken from a rock nicknamed Cheyava Falls, and it contains minerals and chemical structures that on Earth are typically associated with microbial biological activity. Specifically, the presence of ferrous iron phosphate and iron sulfide, arranged in patterns consistent with redox reactions driven by microorganisms, has led researchers to conclude that while non-biological explanations cannot be ruled out, a biological origin is among the most plausible. The findings were published in the journal Nature, following a year-long peer review process, and NASA's acting administrator at the time described it as the closest humanity had ever come to finding evidence of life on Mars. Scientists have been careful to stress that this is not confirmation of life. It is a potential biosignature, which means it is a feature that could have a biological origin, but which requires further study before any firm conclusion can be reached. The only way to know for certain would be to bring the samples back to Earth and subject them to analysis with instruments far more sensitive than anything that can currently be sent to Mars. That process, as things stand, is still years away. What connects all of this? The Soviet missions of the 1970s, the secrets that surrounded them, and the discoveries being made today is the persistence of a question that human beings have been asking for as long as they have been looking up at the night sky. Are we alone? The Soviets asked it in their own way, with rovers and landers and instruments buried in soil on a planet hundreds of millions of kilometers from home. The answers they found, whatever they were not always shared, but the question itself never went away. On the 9th of April 2020, a Russian cosmonaut aboard the International Space Station pointed a camera out of the window and started recording. His name was Ivan Wagner, and what he intended to capture was one of the more visually striking phenomena that astronauts regularly witness from orbit, the aurora australis, also known as the Southern Lights. From the ground, the aurora appears as ribbons of green and other colors dancing across the night sky. From space, it looks different, a kind of luminous crown sitting above the curve of the Earth, quiet and vast. Wagner had seen it before, but it was the sort of thing that remained worth filming. What he did not expect to film was something else entirely. In the video, which Wagner later posted to social media, you can see the curved edge of the Earth, a scattering of stars in the background, and the faint glow of the aurora below. But off to the left of the frame, moving in a slow and deliberate formation, there are between 4 and 5 objects with bright lights, spaced at equal distances from one another, gliding steadily across the view. They do not move the way satellites typically move, and their formation is precise in a way that is difficult to explain casually. The clip lasts roughly 1 minute, though Wagner noted that the footage was recorded in time-lapse, meaning the objects were visible for approximately 52 seconds in real time. Wagner submitted the footage to the International Space Station for analysis. As of today, no official explanation has ever been provided. The ISS has not commented publicly on the video, and whatever analysis may have taken place has not been shared with the public. The footage remains unexplained. It would be easy to treat this as an isolated curiosity, the kind of ambiguous video that surfaces periodically and then fades from public attention. But when you place it alongside everything else that has been happening in the years since, it starts to look less like an isolated incident and more like one data point in a much larger picture. The question of what governments know about unidentified objects in the sky and how much of that knowledge they have chosen to share has moved from the margins of public conversation into its center. In September 2025, the United States House Oversight Committee's task force on the declassification of federal secrets held a dedicated hearing on unidentified anomalous phenomena, the term now used in official context in place of UFOs. Current and former military personnel testified about encounters with objects that appeared to demonstrate capabilities beyond anything in the known inventory of any nation. Lawmakers used the hearing to push for stronger protections for whistleblowers willing to come forward with information, and to press for greater transparency from the intelligence community and the Department of Defense. Later that year, a documentary called The Age of Disclosure was released to cinemas and streaming platforms. It featured interviews with 34 current and former senior United States government officials, including figures from the intelligence community and the military. The film alleged that a cover-up of information relating to non-human intelligence had been running for roughly 80 years and that the most significant evidence remained classified. Whether or not one accepts that framing, the fact that individuals at that level of government were willing to go on record with those claims represents a notable shift from how the subject was treated even a decade ago. None of this proves anything on its own. Claims of cover-ups are easy to make and difficult to substantiate. The absence of an official explanation for something is not, by itself, evidence that the explanation is being deliberately withheld. And the history of the UFO and UAP subject is long enough and tangled enough with misinformation that caution is genuinely warranted. But caution is not the same as dismissal, and the volume and credibility of the voices now raising these questions makes simple dismissal harder to justify than it once was. What ties all of this together? the Soviet secrets, the unexplained footage from the ISS, the congressional hearings, the classified files, is a pattern that has persisted across decades and across national borders. Information about what has been observed in space and what has been found on other planets has not always made its way to the public in full. Some of it has been held back for reasons of national security. Some of it has emerged through leaks and whistleblowers rather than official channels. And some of it, in all likelihood, has not yet come out at all. The Venera missions detected traces of organic molecules on the surface of Venus during their final run in the early 1980s. What the Soviet scientists made of that finding and what further investigation it may have prompted behind closed doors has never been fully disclosed. Meanwhile, the debate over phosphine in Venus's atmosphere continues, with researchers presenting what they describe as increasingly strong evidence for its presence, and a private mission currently in development that could reach the planet as early as 2026 to look for organic chemistry directly. On Mars, NASA's Perseverance rover has now returned what scientists are calling the strongest evidence yet for potential ancient microbial life, found in rock samples from an ancient river valley that once held liquid water. The question of whether life exists, or once existed, on our neighbouring planets is no longer a fringe idea. It is being taken seriously by researchers at the highest levels of planetary science. And yet the full picture of what humanity already knows, gathered across decades of missions by multiple space agencies, some of which operated under conditions of intense secrecy, remains incomplete. The Soviet Union ran one of the most productive space exploration programs in history. It gathered data from Venus and Mars that no other nation had been able to collect. Not all of that data has ever been made public. Some of it was revealed years after the fact by individuals who had been part of the program. Some of it may still be sitting in archives that have never been opened to outside scrutiny. The story of the Soviet space program is, in many ways, a story about what gets recorded and what gets shared. The achievements were real, the data was real, the missions, the rovers, the landers, the photographs, all of it happened. What remains uncertain is how much of what was found along the way has been allowed to reach the people who might benefit from knowing it. That uncertainty is not unique to the Soviet Union. It is a thread that runs through the history of space exploration more broadly, and one that shows no sign of being fully resolved anytime soon.